What if the single most important decision you ever made wasn't a grand choice, wasn't a calculated move, wasn't something you planned or prayed over for months, but a split-second moment of compassion that everyone around you laughed at? What if the act that changed your entire life looked, from the outside, like the most foolish thing a struggling woman could possibly do? This is a story about that kind of moment. About a woman who had almost nothing, who was already carrying more than her share, and who stopped anyway. Not because she knew what it would lead to. Not because she was expecting a reward. But because something in her, something the world had tried and failed to grind out of her, simply could not walk past a person in need. And because of that one decision, everything changed. Not just for her. For an entire village. Her name was Amina. And when this story begins, she was a widow with a young son, a nearly empty home, and a community that had decided, without much deliberation, that she was someone worth ignoring at best and mocking at worst. She woke before the sun every morning and went to sleep long after it had set. She stretched what little she had with the particular creativity that poverty teaches. She carried the specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from laziness but from fighting for survival every single day without anyone fighting alongside you. Her husband was gone, lost to drink, the way some men lose themselves gradually and then all at once. What he left behind was a child who needed feeding, a house with gaps in the walls, and the cold certainty that nobody was coming to make things easier. On the morning this story really starts, Amina left her home early with her son walking beside her, asking in the innocent way that only children ask about things that break their mothers' hearts. When would they have fresh bread again? She smiled without answering. She didn't have an answer. What she had was a straw basket and a direction, and sometimes that has to be enough. When she turned the corner onto the main dirt road, the usual group was already assembled. The ones who produced very little but talked constantly. They were gathered in their habitual spot, leaning against the rocks as if the rocks belonged to them, voices carrying that particular loudness of people who mistake volume for importance. The moment they saw her, the commentary started. One of them, the village's most dedicated gossip, a woman named Tana, pointed and announced Amina's arrival as though it were a news event worth reporting. The laughter that followed was the kind designed to be heard by its target. Amina did not slow down. She did not respond. She held her chin at the angle her mother had taught her and kept walking, because she had learned a long time ago that people who exist primarily to diminish others are not owed the gift of your attention or your reaction. She thought of something her mother used to say when she was a girl. When you help the weak, you help yourself. The good you give is never lost, even when the whole world laughs. She found him further down the road. He was an old man. Thin in the way that speaks of years rather than appetite. He was bent over a bundle of firewood that was genuinely too large for his body, his fingers working at the rope with the slow, careful determination of someone whose hands no longer moved the way they once did. His whole posture spoke of a man who had been trying to do this alone for a very long time and had not allowed himself to stop trying. Nobody in the village had stopped to help him. Not the strong men who passed him on the road. Not the women who saw him struggling. The collective decision had been made, wordlessly, the way village decisions often are. He was not their problem. Amina stepped forward without waiting to be asked. She took the straw rope from his trembling hands and began organizing the wood herself, methodically, with the practiced efficiency of someone who knows how to work. The old man looked up at her. For a moment he said nothing. Then a slow smile crossed his face. The kind of smile that takes effort when a person has been going a long time without one. You again, he said, barely above a whisper. He had seen her before, briefly, the previous day. No one else wanted to help me. Amina said simply that God had given her enough strength for 2 people that day. It was not a performance of virtue. It was just the truth as she understood it. The men who passed them while they worked did not miss the opportunity. Comments flew in their direction like stones. She was crazy. She was starving herself to help a beggar. She had lost her mind entirely. Amina tightened the knot on the rope and swallowed the humiliation the way you swallow something hard and sharp. The tears were there. They found the corners of her eyes. But she was not going to let them fall in front of people who had no understanding of what compassion actually costs, or what it actually means. When the bundle was ready, The old man tried to lift it himself and nearly fell. Amina caught the weight before it took him down, settled it across her own shoulder alongside her share, and the two of them walked together down the dusty road toward the river. An old man and a young widow, moving at the pace the old man's body permitted, which was slow and deliberate and not at all the pace the mocking voices behind them would have chosen. At the riverbank, under the sparse shade of the trees, with the sound of water moving between stones, the old man sat down and was quiet for a long time. He looked at his reflection in the river. He said, softly, that no one had called him father in a long time. Amina offered him the gourd of water she had brought for her son and told him to drink, that it wasn't much but it was clean. He drank slowly, as a man drinks when he recognizes a kindness for what it is. He told her she shouldn't be seen with him, that the village would talk. She told him that if she let what people said direct her life, her son would have been hungry long ago. In the silence that followed, Amina looked up at the sky and thought about everything she had lost. Her husband, gone. The warmth of a blanket on cold nights, gone. The certainty of having something to give her child, always uncertain. And yet here she was, beside a stranger, giving away the water meant for her son, because she believed, not as a philosophy but as a bone-deep conviction, that goodness was not a currency you spent. It was a root. It held you in the ground when everything else tried to wash you away. The old man watched her with eyes that held something she didn't notice in that moment. A quality of attention that went beyond ordinary gratitude. He spoke quietly, almost to himself, a hard life that couldn't harden her. Then he looked at her directly and said that one day the world would see who she truly was. Amina, embarrassed, said she didn't want to be seen. She just wanted peace. She said life had taken a great deal from her, but it still let her choose whether to harden or to feel. She chose to feel. She walked home that evening with dusty feet and the particular tiredness of someone who has given something real. But her spirit was lighter than it had been in a long time. She sat at her doorway when her son was asleep and watched the moonlight work its way through the leaves, and she said a prayer in the voice she used for prayers, quiet, direct, without performance. Give me strength to keep going without anger. Give me faith to keep helping even when they laugh. Across the fields, the old man looked at the same moon. And nobody in the village yet understood that in that shared moment, something had begun to move that none of them had the eyes to see. The days that followed carried the same heat, the same dirt roads, the same faces with their same reflexive cruelty. But Amina kept going back. She brought him small things from her own household. A piece of cassava, a handful of corn, fresh water. Sometimes she divided her son's portion, reasoning in the particular logic of a mother with a good heart that her son could eat tomorrow, but the old man had less time than tomorrow. She expected nothing in exchange. The help was clean of conditions. And that quality, the absence of any calculation behind the kindness, was something the old man noticed with the attention of someone who had spent a very long time watching how people treat the vulnerable when they believe nothing is watching back. The village, meanwhile, took the only action available to people who cannot understand what they are witnessing. It made up stories. The whispers escalated from confused to cruel, as whispers always do when they go unchallenged. The idea that Amina might simply be helping an old man because it was the right thing to do was apparently too simple a story to sustain. So they embellished it. The comments at the well, in the square, at doorways, they were designed to shame her into stopping, to make the cost of her goodness high enough that self-preservation would win. Her husband Barco heard the rumors one afternoon in his particular state, numbed by palm wine, hollow with the frustration of a man who had let failure rot into resentment. When the gossip reached him, it gave the rage inside him something to attach to. He came home with the staggering certainty of a man who has decided to believe the worst interpretation of everything. His accusation was loud and crude. Amina turned to face him with a steadiness that surprised them both. She said she had helped someone who had no one. He responded with a slap that turned the room sideways. She held her crying son. She looked at the man she had once loved and told him, quietly, that the only shame in this house belonged to whoever had forgotten what it meant to be a man. The words went deeper than the blow. He didn't have an answer for them. He left the way men leave when they've been seen clearly and don't know how to stand it. That night Amina knelt by the small lamp and asked God not to let her repay hatred with hatred. She was not asking for her husband to be punished. She was asking for the strength to remain herself in spite of everything that was being done to her. The next morning she went back to the road. The old man saw her face and the marks the night had left on it. He asked no questions. He said simply that men lose themselves when they let pride guide their hunger, but that God did not sleep. She sat beside him by the river and felt, strangely, more comforted than she had felt anywhere else. He judged nothing. He asked nothing. He was simply present, which is its own form of shelter, rarer and more valuable than most people ever recognize. And then, without warning, he was gone. The road was empty one morning. The stone where he usually sat held no one. His bundle was not there, no rope, no footprints in the damp earth. Amina stood for a while and waited for the feeling of his absence to make sense to her. It didn't. She went back the next day and the day after that, and the silence where he had been felt different from ordinary emptiness. It felt like a pause rather than an ending, like something held its breath. The village, of course, had its theories. He had died alone in the forest. He had wandered off to find distant relatives. No one knew and no one particularly cared, except to use his disappearance as fresh material for mocking the woman who had wasted her time and her child's food on someone who wasn't even worth staying. Amina heard every version of this commentary and said nothing. She kept tending her small fire, feeding her son, praying in the dark. At night she sometimes spoke to the wind in the direction of wherever he might be, asking it to carry the message that she hoped he was at peace. She had no way of knowing what was being prepared. No way of knowing that the old man's absence was not an ending but a movement from one scene to the next. That the firewood and the dust and the mockery had all been the opening of a story whose second act was about to begin. On a market morning, when the village was busy with its commerce and noise and the particular self-satisfaction of people going about their ordinary business, a sound started in the distance that was not ordinary. Drums. Not the casual drums of celebration, the measured, heavy drums of something official, something that arrives with weight. The sound moved through the ground before it reached the ears, and one by one, people stopped what they were doing and turned toward it. From the northern path, a procession emerged. Men in pale tunics. Guards carrying spears that caught the morning light. And at the center of it all, a litter draped in white cloth, moving with the deliberate pace of something that understood its own importance. A voice from the procession carried over the crowd's murmuring. The new chief had arrived. Nobody even knew the old chief had died. The information landed in the village square like something dropped from a great height. The procession halted beneath the sacred tree. The crowd pressed forward. The curtain of the litter opened. The silence that followed was total. The kind of silence that happens when a crowd stops breathing at the same time. The man who emerged from the litter was wearing a white tunic. He leaned on a carved wooden staff. Around his neck hung a collar of golden beads, and his white hair was clean and carefully arranged. His posture was upright. His gaze was dignified and steady. And his face was entirely, unmistakably, impossibly familiar. It was the old man. The same old man who had dragged firewood along the dirt road. The same one they had called a beggar. The same one they had said was a useless burden not worth helping. Standing before them all now as their chief, with the bearing of someone born to command, wearing the evidence of who he had always been. The murmur that moved through the crowd was something between shock and shame and the particular vertigo of realizing that the story you've been telling yourself about a situation was completely wrong. People looked at each other. Some looked away. Nobody wanted to be looked at too closely in that moment. Amina stood at the edge of the square with her son's hand in hers. When she saw him, every part of her went still. Her son looked up and asked, in the guileless way of children who say the thing everyone else is thinking, if that was the firewood man. She could not speak. She nodded. The old man, the chief, looked out over the crowd that had mocked him and dismissed him and walked past him and let him struggle alone. His expression was not triumphant. It was something more serious than triumph. He raised his staff and spoke, and his voice, which had always been gentle, was now also clear and full of a weight that made everyone listen. He told them he had lived among them without revealing himself. He had walked the same roads, breathed the same dust, felt the same thirst. He had done this deliberately, because gold and power cannot tell you what you actually need to know about the people who will inherit the land. Only watching them when they believe nothing important is watching will show you their true character. He had come to see with his own eyes who still held kindness in their heart when there was no benefit in showing it, no audience worth impressing, no calculation that made it the smart choice. He had seen many turn away. He had seen many laugh. He had seen grown men refuse the most basic human acknowledgement to a trembling elder on a dusty road. And he had seen one woman who did not do any of those things. One woman who stopped when everyone else kept walking, who shared water meant for her child, who sat in the dust of a riverbank and offered human presence to a person the village had decided was beneath their notice. He paused. Every head in the square had already turned slowly toward Amina, the way heads turn when a story suddenly clarifies itself and a single person becomes its center. She had not helped him because she thought he was someone important, the chief said. She had helped him because she saw the humanity in every person regardless of their appearance or their apparent usefulness. And that was precisely why God had seen her when no one else did. Amina stepped back. Her heart was a chaos of things she had no names for. Her son squeezed her hand. The chief looked at her directly, and in that look was the recognition of every moment they had shared on that road, the weight they had carried together, the laughter they had ignored together, the prayers spoken in parallel to the same moon. He said she had carried more than firewood that day. She had carried the weight of the village's destiny without knowing it. And what had been despised would now be exalted before everyone. Nobody in the square made a sound. Some people were crying. Some were hiding their faces. Barco, standing somewhere in the crowd, had lowered his head and was looking at the ground with the expression of a man who is understanding something about himself for the first time, and finding it almost unbearable to look at. The chief turned back to the crowd and delivered words that moved through the square like thunder. True power, he said, does not live in wealth or in physical strength. It lives in goodness. Those who can act with love when the world around them is being cruel, those people are worthy to lead even the hardest hearts. He announced that the lands of the village would pass to those who still knew how to love without measuring the cost. And he declared before everyone that those lands, the rich, fertile lands that the whole village depended on, belonged to Amina and to her descendants. Amina covered her face with her hands. Her son put his arms around her legs and whispered that the chief was talking about them. She held him tighter than she had held anything in a long time. The chief was not finished. He turned to Barco and spoke with the measured precision of someone whose anger has been refined by time into something more useful than rage. He described a man who had used poverty as a reason to wound the very person he should have protected, who had chosen to throw stones at a woman who was building something real with her bare hands while he sat in a corner and let himself dissolve. He issued his judgment. Barco would lose his home, would work the community fields until the labor taught him what respect actually means, not as punishment, but as curriculum, as the education his choices had prevented him from receiving. When Barco fell to his knees and looked at his wife, Amina did not look away. She looked at him with the eyes of someone who has suffered a great deal and has made peace with it, which is different from the eyes of someone who has simply endured. She told him that forgiveness was not forgetting. It was release. She said she hoped God would help him find the man he had lost somewhere inside himself. The chief watched this and was quiet. Then he raised his staff one final time and said, "Let this moment be written into the memory of this village. Let the children grow up knowing that kindness is stronger than cruelty and that love does not bend to injustice." The drums began again. Not the drums of power, but the drums of something else, of justice arriving, finally, in the right form. The days that followed were different from any that had come before. The same roads, the same trees, the same red earth. But different. Amina still woke before dawn, still lit the fire, still tended the garden. But the ground under her feet had changed its character. The land she had been given was fertile and abundant, and the villagers helped her work it, not because they were ordered to, but because something in them had been woken up. Because they had seen themselves reflected in the chief's words and had not liked what they saw, and were now choosing, quietly, to become different. Women came to learn from her. how to store seeds, how to use herbs, how to make enough go further than it looks like it should. Men who had once made the air thick with mockery now listened to her with something close to reverence. The old chief visited without ceremony, arriving on horseback and then walking the rest of the way, watching Amina and her son working in the fields with the satisfied expression of someone who has spent a long time being patient and has finally been vindicated. He told his council that power only has value when it is used to protect the good. He repeated this often, in different situations, as if he wanted it to become a reflex rather than a thought. Amina's son Kofi grew up straight and steady, with his mother's eyes and his mother's way of being present in a room. He helped the chief with records and decisions, and the old man called him sole grandson, and the three of them under the sacred tree on quiet afternoons formed the image of something that the village would tell its children about for generations. Barco returned when his time of labor was complete. He was thinner, quieter, with the specific humility of someone who has been emptied out by honest work and reflection and has found that what fills the space is something better than what was there before. He stood before Amina and said he did not expect to be taken back. He only wanted to thank her. He said it had been her pain that woke him up. She looked at him without judgment and told him that time punishes but it also teaches. She wished him a new life without the weight of what was behind. The chief watched from a distance and understood that justice had arrived, not through the satisfaction of a punishment administered, but through the transformation of a person. And that was the more complete version of justice, the one that actually changes something. Years moved through the village the way years do, quietly reshaping things without announcing themselves. The land flourished. The crops fed not just the village but travelers who came through from other places. Some came specifically to meet the woman whose story had crossed the boundaries of their own territory, the widow who had helped a dying man carry firewood and had carried, without knowing it, the fate of an entire community in the same act. Amina received them all the same way, with water and shade and the unhurried attention of someone who has nothing to prove. She grew old surrounded by the particular warmth that follows a life lived without cruelty and without compromise. The wrinkles that came were the marks of harvest, not of suffering. Her hands, still calloused, still touched the earth with tenderness. Around her, things were calmer. There was peace where contempt had been, faith where fear had lived. One morning near dawn she walked with Kofi, now a grown man, through the fields. The sun came up slowly, gilding everything. She stopped and looked at the horizon and breathed in the early light. She told her son that life was like this. Some days it gives you the weight and other days it gives you wings. What mattered was never to forget to be grateful for both. Kofi watched her with eyes that had filled with tears, because he understood she was not only talking about the fields. He was watching a woman describe her own life from the inside, and what she described was something he would spend the rest of his existence trying to be worthy of. When the old chief passed, Amina walked at the front of the procession. Among his belongings they found a single handwritten line, the sentence he had repeated so many times in councils and in conversation: "Power only has value when used to protect the good." She wept when she read it. She also smiled. Because the old man had lived that sentence and now it was written down so it could outlive him, which is the only real immortality any of us can earn. The village carried her name forward the way it carries the names of those who gave it something real. Not because she had sought recognition, but because the opposite of her, cruelty, indifference, the comfortable choice to keep walking, had been so clearly revealed in the same story that there was no avoiding the comparison. Children grew up with her name as a reference point. When someone did something that cost them something in order to help another person, people said it was the way Amina did it. Meaning, without calculation, without audience, without any guarantee that anything would come of it. Because that is the final truth of this story. Amina did not help that old man because she knew he was the owner of the village lands. She did not know. She helped him because he was a person struggling with a load too heavy for his body, and she had the strength to share it. Everything that followed was not a transaction. It was a consequence. The universe responding, in its unhurried way, to the quality of a single human decision. Goodness, she used to say near the end of her days, is the only seed that never dies. It only waits for the right time to bloom. And she was right. She had been right from the very first morning when she picked up that bundle of firewood, and the whole village laughed. The laughter faded. The kindness remained. The laughter always fades. The kindness, if it is real, if it comes from the root and not the surface, the kindness always remains. If this story reached something real in you, do me a favor and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I genuinely love hearing from you. Hit the like button if this moved you, because it helps more people find stories worth finding. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that quiet goodness is never wasted. And subscribe with notifications on so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.